My name is Vanessa Ortiz, and I'm 27 years old, 6 months pregnant with my first child. For 3 years, I'd been married into a family that always felt slightly off in ways I couldn't fully name, a quiet tension that lived just beneath the surface of every holiday, every dinner, every forced smile across a table. I'd sensed something in my husband's relationship with his father that made me uneasy, a kind of careful deference that looked less like respect and more like fear. I never imagined that instinct would prove correct in the most violent way possible, or that the people meant to protect me and my unborn child would be the ones who hurt us instead. The Thanksgiving table was crowded that year, my mother-in-law's china set out carefully, candles flickering between serving dishes, when an argument broke out between my father-in-law, Gerald, and my husband Mark, over something trivial. A comment about Mark's job that quickly spiraled into old familiar resentment. I tried to diffuse it gently, the way I always had, suggesting we focus on the meal instead. Gerald turned toward me sharply, his face flushed with anger that had clearly been building for years, not minutes. "Stay out of it," he snapped, and before I fully understood what was happening, he pressed the lit end of his cigar directly against my pregnant belly, holding it there for one horrifying second before I screamed and instinctively lurched backward. Mark, instead of pulling his father away, grabbed my arms from behind and pinned them to my sides, hissing at me to calm down, to stop making a scene, as though my pain were the disruption but rather than the burn, spreading fire across my skin. To understand how I ended up restrained by my own husband while his father burned me, you have to understand the family I'd married into 3 years earlier without fully recognizing its shape. Gerald had built his identity around control, the undisputed head of a household where disagreement wasn't tolerated and obedience was rewarded with brief, conditional approval. Mark had grown up under that same control, trained since childhood to smooth over his father's outbursts rather than confront them, to prioritize peace at any cost, even the cost of his own dignity. I'd witnessed smaller versions of this dynamic throughout our marriage, moments where Mark would go quiet and pliable the instant his father raised his voice, where family gatherings required a kind of careful choreography designed to avoid triggering Gerald's temper. I'd noticed the warning signs and minimized them, the way people often do when love makes them generous with excuses. Mark's mother had quietly pulled me aside once, early in our relationship, and warned me gently that Gerald had a temper. A warning I'd filed away without fully absorbing its weight. I told myself Mark was different, that his gentleness with me meant he'd never allow his father's cruelty to touch our lives directly. I hadn't accounted for how deeply Mark's fear of his father ran, how automatically he defaulted to protecting Gerald's comfort over protecting me, especially in a moment as sudden and shocking as the one now unfolding across that Thanksgiving table. The pain radiated through my abdomen in waves, sharp and burning, and beneath it, a deeper terror took hold. The fear that something might be wrong with the baby, that this violence might reach further than my skin. Around the table, relatives sat frozen, forks suspended midair, nobody moving to help, nobody speaking a single word of protest. My mother-in-law stared down at her plate, her hands trembling slightly, decades of practiced silence keeping her fixed in place even now. Mark's grip on my arms tightened rather than loosened, his voice low and urgent near my ear, telling me to sit down, to stop overreacting, that his father hadn't meant it, that I was embarrassing everyone in front of the family. I felt something shift inside me in that moment, a clarity cutting straight through the panic and pain. This wasn't a misunderstanding to smooth over. This was violence, directed at me and at my unborn child, met immediately by my own husband's decision to restrain me rather than protect me. Every instinct I had, the fierce, sudden protectiveness of a mother sensing danger to her child, overrode the years of conditioning that had taught me to stay quiet, to keep the peace, to make myself smaller in rooms like this one. I stopped trying to pull away from Mark's grip, and instead drove my elbow backward, hard into his ribs, feeling him gasp and loosen his hold in surprise. The moment his fingers slackened, I twisted free and turned to face both of them fully, my back finally free of his restraint, my hand instinctively covering my belly where the burn still throbbed beneath my dress. Gerald took a step toward me again, still furious, still certain of his authority in that room, and I didn't wait for him to reach me. I picked up the water glass beside my plate and threw its contents directly into his face, watching him stumble back, sputtering, genuine shock replacing his anger for the first time all evening. "Don't you ever touch me again," I said, my voice shaking but unmistakably clear, cutting through the stunned silence of that dining room. Mark reached for my arm again, still trying to manage the situation the way he always had, and I pulled away sharply, putting the length of the table between us. And you, I said, turning to him, you held me down while your father burned me. You need to understand exactly what you just did. The room remained frozen, every relative watching now, with expressions shifting from shock to a slow, uncomfortable recognition of what they'd just witnessed and failed to stop. Mark's mother finally rose from her chair, her hands still trembling, and moved toward me, apologizing quietly, offering to help, decades of silence finally cracking under the weight of what had just happened in front of her. I told her I needed to go to the hospital, that the burn needed to be checked, that I needed to know the baby was safe. Gerald, still wiping water from his face, muttered something about overreactions, about hormones, refusing even now to acknowledge what he'd actually done. Mark stood frozen near his chair, torn visibly between his father's expectation of loyalty and the reality of what he'd just participated in, unable to fully meet my eyes. At the hospital that night, doctors confirmed the burn required treatment, but hadn't harmed the baby, a relief so overwhelming I cried for the first time since the incident began. A nurse, noticing the shape and placement of the burn, asked careful, practiced questions about how it happened, and I answered honestly, watching her expression shift into the particular calm alertness of someone trained to recognize abuse. Photographs were taken, a report was filed. Mark sat beside me through all of it, apologizing repeatedly, explaining that he'd panicked, that he hadn't been thinking clearly, that he'd never imagined his father would actually hurt me. I listened to every word and understood, with total clarity, that panic didn't explain restraining me while I was actively being burned. I didn't go back to Gerald and Mark's family Thanksgiving table after that night. And within 2 weeks, I'd moved into my sister's spare bedroom, taking the first real space I'd had in years to think clearly about what kind of family I wanted my child born into. Mark called daily, alternating between apology and pleading, promising therapy, promising distance from his father, promising the version of himself I'd married, rather than the one who'd pinned my arms while I screamed. I told him I needed time, real time, not performed urgency, to decide whether trust could exist again, in a marriage where his first instinct under pressure had been to protect his father's comfort over my safety. 6 weeks later, with the burn nearly healed and my daughter kicking steadily inside me, I made my decision clear. I filed for a legal separation, set firm boundaries around any future contact with Gerald, and told Mark that rebuilding trust, if it happened at all, would require years of consistent proof rather than words spoken in the aftermath of consequence. I wasn't interested in reconciliation built on fear of being alone. I was interested only in safety, for myself and for my daughter, and in never again standing in a room where my pain was treated as an inconvenience to manage rather than a crisis demanding protection. Lying awake now, my daughter's due date approaching, I understand something I wish I'd trusted sooner. Love that requires you to shrink yourself in the face of someone else's cruelty was never love worth protecting. I fought back that night because some other instinct in me, older and fiercer than 3 years of quiet conditioning, refused to stay silent any longer. If you've ever been hurt by the people who were supposed to protect you and found yourself finally, fiercely fighting back, you already understand exactly what that Thanksgiving table felt like, and exactly why walking away afterward was the only choice that made sense.